"You're not part of this family anymore." My son said it like he was passing the salt, not like he was cutting me out of his life on Christmas Eve. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink right away. I just sat there at the head of the table I had set with my best china, the same one I used every year since Daniel was a boy, back when Christmas meant something different. The turkey was still steaming in the center, the scent of rosemary and butter filling the room, and the lights from the tree in the corner reflected softly off the glassware. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. But something had shifted. Something final. Rachel didn't say a word. She just sipped her wine, her lips curling slightly like she had been waiting for this moment. I noticed the way Daniel avoided looking at me, his eyes fixed on his plate, his jaw tight but not conflicted. Not confused. Certain. That was what struck me the most. Not anger. Not even discomfort. Just certainty. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, feeling the smooth fabric of my navy dress, the one I had bought just last month because Rachel said we should dress a little nicer this year. I should have known then. I should have known a lot of things. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice steady, quieter than I expected. Daniel finally looked up, but only for a second. "Mom, it's time. This house, this life, it's ours now. You've had your time." Had my time. I let the words settle in the air between us. 37 years of raising him. 37 Christmas mornings, wrapping presents before dawn, making cinnamon rolls from scratch, sitting on the floor while he tore open boxes with that same smile he used to have before everything changed. Had my time. Rachel set her glass down gently, the soft clink echoing louder than it should have. "We think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay," she added, her tone polished. "Almost kind if you didn't listen too closely. It's just more practical this way." Practical. I nodded slowly, as if I understood, as if this was a conversation we had all agreed to have. My eyes drifted to the tree, to the ornaments I had collected over decades. Each one had a story, a memory. There was the little wooden reindeer Daniel made in 2nd grade, still slightly crooked, still my favorite. There was the glass angel my husband bought the year before he passed, back when he held my hand in crowded stores and whispered that everything would be okay. I wondered briefly what he would say if he were here now. Then I realized it didn't matter. He wasn't here. And neither, it seemed, was my place in this family. I stood up carefully, smoothing the front of my dress, making sure my hands didn't shake. "I see," I said. "Just that. Nothing more." I didn't ask where I was supposed to go. I didn't ask how long I had. I didn't ask why. Because the truth was already sitting at that table with us, silent and undeniable. I walked to the hallway, the hardwood floors creaking softly beneath my feet, the same familiar sound that used to make this house feel alive. I paused by the coat rack, reaching for my wool coat, the one Daniel had given me 3 years ago. "For those cold winter mornings," he had said. I slipped it on slowly, button by button, as if I had all the time in the world. Behind me, I could hear the faint clatter of utensils, the quiet murmur of voices continuing as though nothing had happened, as though I had already disappeared. I picked up my purse, glanced once more toward the dining room, but I didn't step back in. There was nothing left for me there. Not tonight. Not anymore. The front door opened with a familiar click, letting in the crisp December air. It was colder than I expected. Or maybe I just wasn't ready for it. I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me, careful not to make a sound. The Christmas lights along the porch blinked softly, casting small, warm glows across the snow-dusted yard. For a moment I stood there, listening to the quiet. No laughter. No music. Just silence. I took a breath, slow and steady, watching it disappear into the night. Then I walked down the steps, one at a time, my heels pressing into the thin layer of snow, leaving behind a trail that would be gone by morning. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because somewhere between the first step and the last I understood. Something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't impulsive. It had been building for a long time, hidden in polite smiles, in missed calls, in conversations that stopped when I entered the room. And now finally it had a voice. Clear. Cold. Certain. I reached the end of the driveway and paused, pulling my coat tighter around me. Across the street, I could see other houses glowing with warmth, families gathered inside, laughter spilling through windows. For a brief moment, I wondered what it must feel like to still belong somewhere like that. Then the thought passed. Because something else, something quieter but stronger, had begun to settle in its place. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't even angry. Not yet. I was simply still. And that stillness felt different. Felt like the beginning of something. Something they hadn't expected. Something they hadn't prepared for. I adjusted my purse on my shoulder and stepped forward into the night, already knowing that by tomorrow, everything would change. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and something older that no amount of cleaning could quite erase. The kind of place people pass through without leaving anything behind, and for the first time in decades, I realized that was exactly what I had become to my own family, someone temporary, someone easy to move aside when it became convenient. I set my purse down on the small laminate table near the door and stood there for a moment, still wearing my coat, still holding myself upright as if I were waiting for someone to tell me this was all a misunderstanding. But no one was coming. There was no call, no message, not even the polite kind of apology people offer when they know they have crossed a line but do not intend to step back from it. I walked slowly to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Outside the parking lot was quiet, a thin layer of snow covering the asphalt, reflecting the pale glow of a flickering streetlight. Everything looked still, untouched, as if the world had decided to pause without me. I let the curtain fall back into place and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under my weight, unfamiliar, impersonal, nothing like the bed I had shared with my husband for over 30 years, nothing like the home I had just walked out of without a single raised voice. I placed my hands on my knees and looked down at them, noticing the faint tremor that had finally made its way through, not strong enough to break me, just enough to remind me that something inside had shifted. I did not cry, not because it did not hurt, but because the hurt had already moved past tears. It had settled somewhere deeper, quieter, a place where emotions did not rush out but instead waited, observing, understanding. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up the dim room. There were no missed calls, no messages, nothing but the time and the date, December 25th, the day that used to begin with laughter and end with full plates and warm conversations. I remembered the sound of Daniel running down the stairs as a child, his excitement filling every corner of the house, the way he would stop halfway just to shout that he was ready, that he could not wait any longer. I remembered wrapping gifts late into the night, making sure every bow was perfect, every detail exactly the way he liked it. I remembered believing that those moments meant something permanent, something unbreakable. I leaned back slightly, resting my hands behind me on the bed, and closed my eyes for just a second, letting those memories pass through without holding on to them. Because holding on to them would not change what had happened tonight. It would only make it harder to see what had been happening for years. I opened my eyes again and reached for the small lamp on the nightstand, turning it on. The soft yellow light filled the room just enough to make everything visible, and in that light, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with questions I had avoided asking myself, questions about the way Rachel had gradually taken control of every conversation, every decision, the way Daniel had started to defer to her even in matters that once belonged to us. I thought about the times he had canceled visits, the times he had said he was too busy, the times he had promised to call and never did. I thought about how I had explained it away, how I had told myself that life was simply changing, that this was what happened when children grew up and built their own families. I had mistaken distance for independence, silence for peace, and now, sitting in a room that was not mine, I understood the difference. I stood up slowly and walked over to the small dresser, placing my phone down on its surface. Beside it lay the envelope I had not yet opened, the one I had picked up earlier that afternoon from my mailbox. I had not thought much of it at the time, just another piece of mail to be sorted later, but now it seemed to carry a different kind of weight. I ran my fingers along its edge but did not open it yet. Instead I turned and looked at my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. The woman staring back at me looked composed, older, yes, but not broken, her silver hair neatly in place, her posture still straight, her expression calm in a way that did not match the situation she had just walked out of. I studied that reflection for a moment, searching for something, perhaps weakness, perhaps regret, but what I found instead was clarity, not loud, not overwhelming, just a quiet understanding that tonight had not created anything new. It had simply revealed what had already been there. I reached for the envelope again, this time holding it more firmly, knowing that whatever was inside would not change what I had already begun to see, but it might confirm it, might give shape to the feeling that had been forming in the background of my thoughts. I set it back down once more, deciding that it could wait because right now what mattered was not what was written on paper, but what had been written in the past few years of silence and small dismissals. I walked back to the bed and sat down again, this time more comfortably, removing my coat and folding it neatly beside me. The room felt slightly warmer. Now, or perhaps I had simply adjusted. I lay back slowly, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the heater, each breath steady, controlled. I thought about tomorrow, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet anticipation, because for the first time in a long while, I was not waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. I was not waiting for permission. I was not hoping for things to return to the way they used to be. Those days were gone, and I could finally see that clearly. I turned my head slightly toward the window, though I could not see outside from this angle. I knew the snow was still there, covering everything evenly, erasing footprints, smoothing over the marks left behind, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that perhaps this was not an ending in the way I had first felt it. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something that required silence, patience, and a different kind of strength. I closed my eyes again, not to escape, but to rest, knowing that when morning came, I would not be the same woman who had walked out of that house, and that difference, subtle as it might be now, would be the one thing they had not accounted for, the one thing that would change everything they believed they understood about me. Morning came without ceremony, no gentle transition, no warmth easing its way into the room, just a thin strip of pale light slipping through the gap in the curtains and resting across the edge of the bed like a quiet reminder that time had moved forward whether I was ready or not. I opened my eyes slowly, not startled, not disoriented, just aware. The kind of awareness that does not come from rest but from realization. I lay still for a moment, listening to the same soft hum of the heater, the same distant sound of a car passing by outside, everything unchanged except for the way it felt, because something inside me had settled during the night, something that had been shifting quietly beneath the surface for longer than I had admitted to myself. I sat up carefully, placing my feet on the carpet, the texture unfamiliar, slightly rough against my skin, and for a brief moment I found myself thinking about the floors at home. Polished wood that I used to walk across without noticing. Floors that held decades of footsteps, of routines, of life. I stood up and reached for my coat, then paused, realizing I did not need it right away. The room was warm enough, or perhaps I was simply not as cold as I had been the night before. I walked over to the dresser again, my reflection meeting me without hesitation. The same woman as yesterday, but not quite. There was a stillness in her eyes now, not emptiness, not sadness, but something measured. Something that had finally begun to align with the truth I had avoided for too long. I picked up the envelope I had set aside the night before, turning it over in my hands, studying the return address this time, and when I recognized the name printed in small, precise letters, I felt a quiet confirmation settle into place, not shock, not disbelief, just recognition, because it fit. It fit too well with everything else I had started to piece together. I opened it carefully, sliding the papers out with steady hands, my eyes moving across the lines without rushing, without searching for something specific, because I already knew what I would find, and as I read, each word simply added clarity to what had already been forming in my mind. Documents regarding property, ownership, transfers, language that was meant to look official, clean, undeniable. But beneath it all there was something else, something that had been arranged without me, something that had assumed I would not question it, that I would accept it the way I had accepted so many small changes before. I lowered the papers slowly, holding them at my side as I looked back at my reflection, and this time I did not search for understanding, I already had it. I saw it clearly now, the conversations that had ended too quickly when I entered the room, the subtle way Rachel had begun to speak for Daniel, the decisions that had been presented as if they were already agreed upon. I thought about the afternoon she had casually mentioned updating paperwork, the way she had smiled when she said it, as if it were a simple formality, and how I had nodded without asking questions, trusting, believing, assuming that trust was still something shared between us. I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just controlled, because there was no point in revisiting those moments with regret. They had served their purpose, they had brought me here, to this room, to this understanding. I set the papers back down on the dresser, aligning them neatly, not because I needed order, but because it felt appropriate, precise. I turned and walked to the small table near the door, picking up my purse and checking its contents with quiet efficiency. Everything was there, my wallet, my keys, my phone, the small things that now felt more significant than they had before. I slipped my phone into my coat pocket and paused again, not out of hesitation, but to consider what came next, and for the first time, the question did not feel overwhelming, it felt clear, almost simple, because the uncertainty had been replaced with something else, something steadier. I thought about Daniel, about the way he had spoken the night before, the certainty in his voice, the finality in his words, and I realized that certainty had not come from confidence, it had come from assumption, the assumption that I would remain the same, that I would continue to accept, to adjust, to step back without resistance. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging that he had believed that, and understanding why, because that was who I had been for a long time. I had been the one who smoothed things over, who chose silence over conflict, who believed that keeping peace was more important than asking difficult questions, but that version of me had depended on something that no longer existed. It had depended on mutual respect, on a shared understanding of family, and once that was gone, the silence was no longer protection, it was permission. I walked to the door and placed my hand on the handle, feeling its cool surface beneath my fingers, and in that moment I understood that what I was about to do was not reaction, it was not retaliation, it was simply correction, a quiet adjustment to a situation that had been allowed to drift too far in one direction. I opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air crisp but not harsh, the sky pale and clear, the snow still covering the ground in a smooth, undisturbed layer. I walked across the parking lot at a steady pace, my steps firm, deliberate, leaving behind a new set of footprints that did not hesitate, did not pause. As I reached my car, I unlocked it and slid into the driver's seat, placing my purse beside me. I sat there for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping, not tense, just present. I glanced once more at the motel behind me, the small, quiet place that had held a version of me for a single night, and then I looked forward again because there was nothing back there I needed to carry with me. I started the engine, the sound low and steady, and as I pulled out onto the road, I felt the last traces of uncertainty settle into something more defined, not anger, not bitterness, but resolve, a calm, measured resolve that did not need to announce itself, did not need to be proven, it simply existed. And as the distance between me and that house began to close, I knew that when I arrived, I would not be returning as the woman who had left the night before. I would be returning as someone they had not anticipated, someone they had underestimated, and that difference, quiet as it was, would be enough to change everything they thought they controlled. I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive just as the morning light began to settle across the rooftops, the neighborhood looking exactly the way it always had after a fresh snowfall, quiet, orderly, untouched, as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface, as if last night had not happened at all. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, steady, controlled, the same way my thoughts had become, no longer scattered, no longer searching for explanations that would never come. As I approached the house, I slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to see it clearly, to take in every detail without the filter of memory or expectation. The porch lights were still on, casting a soft glow against the white snow. The wreath I had hung just weeks ago remained centered on the front door, its red ribbon perfectly tied, untouched, unchanged. It struck me then how carefully everything had been preserved on the outside, how deliberate the appearance of normalcy had been, even as something else had been quietly unfolding inside. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, the silence settling in around me, not heavy, not oppressive, just present. I sat there for a moment, my gaze fixed on the front door, remembering how many times I had walked through it without thinking, carrying groceries, decorations, gifts, believing I was entering a place where I belonged without question. I reached for my purse and stepped out of the car, the cold air brushing against my face, sharper now than it had been earlier, or perhaps I was simply more aware of it. My heels pressed into the snow with a soft crunch as I made my way up the driveway, each step deliberate, measured, not rushed, not uncertain. When I reached the front steps, I paused briefly, not because I needed to gather courage, but because I recognized that this moment marked a clear line between what had been and what was about to be. I raised my hand and rang the doorbell, the familiar chime echoing faintly from inside. I waited, my posture straight, my expression calm. There was movement behind the door, a shadow passing across the frosted glass panel. Then the handle turned, and the door opened slowly. Rachel stood there, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly when she saw me, surprise first, then something more controlled, something rehearsed. "Helen," she said, her voice carrying that same polished tone, though there was a slight pause before my name, as if she had not expected to use it so soon again. I met her gaze without tension, without hostility, simply present. "Good morning." I replied, my voice even, unaffected by the cold or the distance that had been placed between us. She stepped slightly to the side, not fully inviting me in, but not blocking the entrance either, a calculated neutrality that I recognized now for what it was. Daniel is still asleep, she added, as if that detail held significance, as if it might delay whatever I had come to say. I nodded, once acknowledging the information without reacting to it. That is fine, I said, my tone steady. I will wait. For a brief second her composure tightened, just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it. Then she turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind her. I stepped inside, the warmth meeting me immediately, along with the faint scent of last night's dinner, still lingering in the air, unchanged, as if time had paused here while everything else had continued moving forward. I closed the door gently behind me and removed my coat, placing it neatly over the back of the chair near the entryway, the same place I had always put it, the familiarity of the gesture not lost on me. I moved toward the living room, my eyes taking in the details without lingering, the tree still lit, the present still arranged beneath it, everything exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. I was no longer part of the scene. Rachel stood near the kitchen, watching me with a quiet attentiveness, her arms loosely crossed, her posture composed but not relaxed. I could see the questions forming, the calculations, the attempt to anticipate what I would do next, but I offered nothing for her to read beyond what was already visible. I walked to the armchair by the window and sat down, folding my hands in my lap, the same way I had done the night before. But this time the stillness carried a different weight, not shock, not restraint, but intention. The house was quiet for a moment. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow at first, then more deliberate. Daniel appeared at the top, his expression shifting as he noticed me, confusion, then something sharper, something defensive. He descended the stairs quickly, stopping a few feet away. "Mom," he said, his voice lower than usual, as if he were trying to control the tone before it fully formed. "What are you doing here?" I looked up at him, meeting his gaze directly, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. "I came to speak with you," I replied, my voice calm, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He exhaled slightly, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen countless times before when he was trying to regain control of a situation. "We already talked about this," he said, though there was a slight hesitation in the words, as if repeating them made them less certain. I tilted my head just slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of what he believed had been decided. "No," I said quietly. "You spoke and I listened." The distinction settled between us, subtle but clear. Rachel shifted her weight near the kitchen, her attention moving between us, waiting, measuring. Daniel's expression tightened, his certainty from the night before no longer as firm, because this was not the reaction he had expected. There was no pleading, no anger, no attempt to negotiate. Just a calm presence that did not align with the role he had assigned to me. I reached into my purse and removed the envelope, holding it lightly in my hands, not presenting it yet, just letting its presence exist in the space between us. His eyes flickered toward it briefly, then back to my face, the first sign of curiosity breaking through his controlled demeanor. I allowed a small pause, not to create tension, but because it felt appropriate, because moments like this required space, not urgency. I looked at him steadily, taking in the subtle changes in his posture, the slight shift in his stance, the way his confidence had begun to adjust, and in that quiet space, I understood that the balance had already begun to move, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not paying attention, but enough to change what would happen next. I placed the envelope on the table beside me, my hand resting on it for just a moment before withdrawing, my voice remaining even, controlled. "There are a few things we need to clarify," I said, not raising my tone, not softening it either, just stating what was already true. And as I sat there, composed and unshaken, I could see it in both of their expressions, the first real sign that they were no longer certain of how this would unfold, and that uncertainty, quiet as it was all I needed. I let the silence settle for a moment after my words, not to create pressure, but because it allowed the truth to breathe on its own. Daniel shifted slightly, his weight moving from one foot to the other, a small sign that the certainty he had carried the night before was beginning to fracture. Rachel remained near the kitchen, her posture still composed, but her attention sharper now, more focused, as if she were trying to anticipate a direction she could no longer fully control. I kept my gaze steady, my hands resting lightly in my lap. Then I reached forward and opened the envelope, sliding the documents out with deliberate care. The sound of paper moving against paper filling the quiet room in a way that felt louder than it should have. I did not rush. I did not glance up to measure their reactions, because this was not about performance, it was about clarity. I placed the first document on the table, turning it so it faced Daniel, then the second, then the third, each one aligned neatly, each one carrying weight that did not need to be explained immediately. His eyes dropped to the papers, then lifted back to me, confusion now more visible. "What is this?" he asked, his voice lower, less certain than before. I met his gaze calmly. "It is what should have been discussed before any decisions were made," I replied, my tone even, not accusing, not defensive, just precise. Rachel stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor, her eyes scanning the documents without touching them, her expression tightening just slightly as she began to recognize the format, the language, the implications. Daniel leaned forward, picking up one of the pages, his eyes moving across the lines, slower this time, more carefully. I watched him as he read, noticing the moment his posture changed, the moment his shoulders lowered just enough to reveal that something did not align with what he had believed. "This does not make sense," he said quietly, almost to himself. I allowed a brief pause before responding, giving the words space to settle. "It makes sense if you read it fully," I said, my voice steady. He looked back down, this time with more attention, more intention. The silence stretched again, not empty, but filled with the quiet unraveling of assumptions. Rachel reached for another document, her movements controlled, but not as effortless as before. She read quickly at first, then slowed, her expression becoming more guarded, more focused, as if she were trying to locate a detail that would restore her confidence. But it did not come, because what they were reading was not new. It was simply something they had chosen not to fully understand before. I folded my hands again, resting them lightly against my knees, watching without interruption, because this moment did not require explanation, it required recognition. Daniel set the paper down carefully, not abruptly, but with a kind of cautious awareness, as if the act of placing it down might change its meaning. "You signed this," he said, looking at me again, his voice carrying a different tone now, one that was searching rather than declaring. I nodded once. "Yes," I replied. "I signed it and I read it." The distinction was small, but it mattered. Rachel's eyes flickered toward me, then back to the documents, her composure tightening further. "This is not what we were told," she said, her voice controlled but edged with something sharper beneath it. I met her gaze briefly, not with challenge, but with quiet acknowledgement. "Then perhaps you were told what you expected to hear," I said, my tone unchanged, the words landing without force but with clarity. Daniel exhaled slowly, running his hand across his forehead, the gesture less controlled this time, more instinctive. "Mom, if this is about the house," he began, but I raised my hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to guide the conversation back to its center. "This is about understanding," I said, "and about making decisions based on facts, not assumptions." My voice remained calm, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Rachel crossed her arms again, but the gesture no longer carried the same confidence. It was more protective now, more contained. "We thought," she began, then stopped, her sentence unfinished, because the foundation it had been built on was no longer steady. I allowed a small silence to follow, not to pressure, but to give space for that realization to take hold. Daniel looked at me again, his expression no longer certain, no longer controlled in the same way. There was something else there now, something closer to awareness, to the recognition that the situation was not as simple as he had believed. I leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance without shifting the tone. "Last night you made a decision," I said quietly. But it was not an informed one. The words were not harsh, not accusatory, they were simply accurate, and in their accuracy they carried weight. Rachel opened her mouth as if to respond, then paused, her eyes moving once more across the documents, searching for something that would restore the narrative she had constructed. But it was not there, because the truth did not need to be constructed, it only needed to be seen. Daniel lowered himself into the chair across from me, his posture different now, less rigid, more uncertain, his hands resting on the table near the papers, not touching them but not avoiding them either. "So what are you saying?" he asked, his voice quieter, more measured. I met his gaze steadily, holding it for a moment before answering, because this was the point where everything began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not reverse. I placed my hand lightly on the edge of the table, not on the documents but near them, grounding the moment in something tangible. "I am saying that what you believed you had is not what you have," I said, my voice calm, unwavering. the words settling into the space between us with a quiet finality, and as I watched the understanding begin to form in his expression, slow but undeniable, I knew that the balance had changed, not completely, not yet, but enough to move us into a different conversation, one where assumptions no longer held power, and where silence would no longer be mistaken for agreement. Daniel did not respond right away, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said, because for the first time since I had walked into the house, he was not trying to control the direction of the conversation, he was trying to understand it. His eyes moved back to the papers, slower now, more deliberate, as if each line carried a weight he had not expected to feel. Rachel remained standing, but her posture had changed. The ease was gone, replaced by something tighter, something that held itself in place rather than flowed naturally. I watched them both without interruption because there was no need to rush what was already unfolding. Daniel picked up another page, reading more carefully this time, his brow tightening slightly. "This says the ownership structure is different than what we discussed," he said, his voice no longer firm, no longer certain. I inclined my head just slightly, acknowledging the observation without adding anything to it, because he needed to arrive at the understanding on his own. Rachel stepped closer to him, her eyes scanning the same lines, her lips pressing together briefly before she spoke. "There must be an earlier version of this," she said, her tone controlled but searching, as if the right explanation could still restore the ground beneath her. I met her gaze for a brief moment, not challenging, not dismissive, simply present. "There is only what was signed and recorded," I said quietly, and then I allowed the words to settle without elaboration. Daniel lowered the paper slowly, his hand resting on the table as if he needed something solid to anchor himself to. "Mom, we were told that everything had already been transferred," he said, and I heard it clearly then, not an accusation but confusion, the kind that comes when a belief begins to lose its shape. I folded my hands together again, keeping my voice even. "You were told what someone assumed would not be questioned," I replied, not raising my tone, not softening it either, just stating what had become clear. Rachel's eyes shifted toward me again, sharper now, more focused. "And you are saying that is not the case?" she said, and this time her voice held a different quality, less polished, more direct. I nodded once. "I am saying that nothing changes without my consent," I answered, the words simple, measured, carrying no force beyond their truth. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze moving from the documents to me and then to Rachel, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of the same reality, one that had felt certain last night and one that was now unfolding in front of him. "But you never said anything," he added, and there it was, the quiet expectation that silence had meant agreement. I held his gaze steadily. "You never asked," I replied, and I did not need to say more, because the weight of that exchange filled the space between us. Rachel turned slightly, pacing a small step toward the kitchen and then back again, her movements controlled but no longer effortless. "We were trying to make things easier," she said, her tone shifting again, reaching for a different position, one that might reframe what had happened. I listened without interruption, then answered calmly. "Easier for whom?" The question was not sharp, not confrontational, it was simply placed where it belonged, and for a moment, neither of them responded because the answer did not fit the version they had been holding on to. Daniel leaned forward again, his hands now resting flat on the table. "So what happens now?" he asked, and this time there was no edge to his voice, no assumption of control, just a question. I observed him for a moment, noticing the shift not just in his words but in the way he carried himself. The certainty had given way to something more open, more uncertain, and in that uncertainty there was space for something different to take form. I reached toward the documents and gathered them slowly, aligning the edges with quiet precision before placing them back into the envelope, my movements unhurried, deliberate. "Now," I said, my voice steady, "we begin with clarity." I looked at him directly, holding his attention without effort. "Last night you acted on what you believed was already decided," I continued, "but nothing was decided." The words were not heavy, not dramatic, they were simply placed in the space where they belonged. Rachel crossed her arms again, but this time the gesture felt less like control and more like protection. "And what are you expecting from us?" she asked, and though her tone remained composed, there was a tension beneath it. I turned my attention to her, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I am not expecting anything," I said. "I am informing you." The distinction settled quietly but firmly. Daniel's eyes returned to me, his expression no longer guarded, but not fully at ease either. "Informing us of what?" he asked, and I allowed a brief pause before answering, not to create suspense, but because the moment required precision, of the fact that this house, this arrangement, and every decision connected to it still involves me. I said, my voice calm, unwavering, the words landing without force but with undeniable clarity. Rachel's posture shifted again, a subtle adjustment that revealed more than any words could have. Daniel remained still, absorbing what had been said, not resisting it, not accepting it fully yet, but no longer dismissing it. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, just enough to change the dynamic of the space, my hands resting at my sides, relaxed, composed. You believed I had stepped aside? I added, my tone unchanged. But I have not. And as I looked at them both, I could see it clearly now, the realization taking shape, not all at once but steadily, like something that had been there all along and was finally being acknowledged. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was not filled with assumption, it was filled with understanding, and in that understanding the balance had shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make it clear that whatever came next would not follow the path they had already decided for me. The shift in the room did not need to be announced, it was already there, subtle but undeniable, resting in the way Daniel no longer stood quite as straight, in the way Rachel's eyes no longer held that quiet certainty they had carried the night before. I remained standing for a moment, allowing that shift to settle fully before I moved again, not because I needed to assert anything, but because I understood that timing mattered. I reached for my coat where I had placed it earlier, lifting it carefully and draping it over my arm, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with intention. Daniel watched me, his gaze following the motion, as if he were trying to understand what it meant, whether it signaled an end or something else entirely. So you are leaving again, he said, and there was something different in his voice now, not dismissal, not authority, but uncertainty. I met his eyes briefly. I am not staying here right now, I replied, my tone even, not defensive, not explanatory, just precise. Rachel shifted slightly, her arms uncrossing, then crossing again, a small movement that revealed more than she likely intended. This is still our home, she said, her voice measured, but lacking the firmness it had held before. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its implication. It is a shared space with defined terms, I said. And the words were not complicated, but they carried weight because they were rooted in something neither of them had fully considered. Daniel glanced toward Rachel, then back at me, his expression tightening for a brief moment before settling again. We thought we were moving forward, he said, and I could hear it clearly, the belief that progress had been made, that a new arrangement had already begun. I held his gaze steadily. You moved forward based on an assumption, I replied, not on an agreement. And I did not raise my voice, I did not soften it, I simply placed the distinction where it belonged. Rachel took a small step forward, her posture adjusting as she tried to regain a sense of direction. Then what is the agreement? She asked, and though her tone remained composed, there was an edge of urgency beneath it now. I considered the question for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because it needed to be stated clearly, without room for misinterpretation. The agreement is that nothing changes without clarity, without consent, and without direct conversation, I said, each part measured, each word placed with intention. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly as he absorbed what I had said. And last night, he began but did not finish because he did not need to. The sentence completed itself in the space between us. I nodded once. Last night was not a conversation, I said quietly. It was a conclusion reached without me. The words were calm, but they did not waver. Rachel looked down briefly, then back up, her expression shifting again, searching for a position that no longer fit as easily as it once had. We were trying to be practical, she said, and though the phrase was familiar, it no longer carried the same certainty. I allowed a small pause before responding, not to challenge but to clarify. Practical decisions still require the involvement of everyone they affect, I said, and I could see it then, the realization beginning to take hold, not fully, not all at once, but enough to alter the way they were standing, the way they were listening. Daniel moved slightly closer to the table, his hand resting near the edge where the envelope had been, his fingers tapping lightly once, then stilling. So what happens now? He asked again, and this time the question was different. It was not searching for direction to follow, it was acknowledging that direction had not yet been set. I picked up my purse, adjusting the strap over my shoulder with a quiet, practiced motion, then looked at him steadily. Now we pause, I said, my voice calm. We do not make decisions in the middle of misunderstanding. Rachel's eyes flickered briefly, then settled again, and after that, she asked, and I could hear the need behind the question, the need to restore structure, to find a path forward that felt certain again. I held her gaze for a moment, not unkindly but without yielding. After that, we speak clearly, we review what is real, and we decide with all information present. I answered, and the words were simple, but they shifted the ground beneath us. Daniel nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something he had not expected to confront. And until then, he said, his voice quieter now. I finished the thought without raising my tone. Until then, nothing changes. The finality of that statement did not come from force, it came from clarity, and in that clarity, there was no room for assumption to return. Rachel looked at me for a long moment, her expression no longer guarded in the same way, but not open either, somewhere in between, as if she were recalibrating, adjusting to a reality that had shifted beyond her initial expectations. I turned toward the door, not abruptly, not as an exit from conflict, but as a continuation of what had already been set in motion, my hand resting lightly on the handle before I opened it, the cold air greeting me again, sharper now against the warmth I was leaving behind. I stepped outside, the snow still undisturbed in places, the sky brighter than it had been earlier. I paused briefly at the top of the steps, not to look back, but to allow the moment to settle fully, because what had just taken place was not an ending, it was a correction, a quiet but undeniable shift in the balance that had been assumed the night before. I walked down the steps slowly, my heels pressing into the snow with the same steady rhythm as before, leaving behind a new set of footprints that did not hesitate, did not falter, and as I reached my car, I understood something with complete clarity. This was no longer about being accepted or rejected. It was about being present in decisions that had always involved me, and that presence, once established, would not be easily dismissed again. I did not start the engine right away, instead I sat there with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the cold seeping through the glass but not reaching me the same way it had the night before, because something inside me had settled into place, something that did not need warmth from outside anymore. I looked at the house through the windshield, not with longing, not with anger, just with clarity, the kind that comes when illusion has finally been removed and nothing is left but what is real. I could still see movement through the front window, silhouettes shifting slightly behind the curtains, their motions slower now, more deliberate, as if they were speaking in lower tones, recalibrating, trying to make sense of what had just happened inside those walls. I did not need to hear the words to understand the conversation. I had lived inside that rhythm long enough to recognize it, the quiet tension, the measured voices, the careful selection of what to say next. I exhaled slowly and reached into my purse, pulling out my phone, the screen lighting up in the stillness of the car. There were still no messages, no missed calls, nothing that suggested urgency or apology, and that absence confirmed what I already knew. This was not a moment they were ready to resolve, this was something they would need to process, something they had not prepared for. I set the phone down in the cup holder and leaned back slightly, allowing myself a brief pause, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the value of stillness, because what I had done this morning was not a reaction, it was a shift, and shifts require space to settle before the next movement begins. I glanced once more at the house, then turned the key, the engine coming to life with a low, steady sound that matched the rhythm of my thoughts. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, not looking back, not needing to confirm anything, because the confirmation had already been given. I drove down the street at a measured pace, the snow lining the edges of the road, the neighborhood still quiet, as if the world had not yet fully awakened, but I had, and that difference felt more significant than anything else. I did not go far, just a few blocks, enough distance to create separation without removing connection. I turned onto a side street and parked along the curb, the engine still running, the heater beginning to warm the space around me. I sat there for a moment, watching the faint movement of a neighbor clearing snow from their driveway, the repetitive motion steady, focused, purposeful, and it struck me how simple clarity could look from the outside, how straightforward it seemed when there was no confusion layered over it. I reached into my purse again and took out the envelope, holding it in my hands, not opening it this time, just feeling its weight, knowing exactly what it represented, not power, not control, but truth, documented, recorded, undeniable. I rested it on my lap and looked forward, my gaze steady, my thoughts aligned, because there was one more step to take, not a confrontation, not an escalation, just a final adjustment, a line drawn not in anger, but in certainty. I picked up my phone again, unlocking it with a smooth motion, my fingers steady as I opened the message screen. Daniel's name appearing at the top, familiar, unchanged, but no longer carrying the same assumptions it once had. I stared at the blank space for a moment, not searching for words but allowing them to form naturally, because what needed to be said was not complicated. It did not require explanation or emotion. It required precision. I began to type slowly, each word placed with intention, no hesitation, no revision, just clarity. I paused once, briefly reading the sentence as a whole, not to correct it, but to confirm it matched exactly what I intended. Then I pressed send, the message leaving the screen without sound, without emphasis, but carrying everything it needed to carry. I set the phone back down and leaned into the seat, my hands resting loosely now, no longer holding on to anything. The stillness returned, but it was different from before. It was not waiting, it was completion. A quiet sense that the balance had fully shifted into place. I did not check the screen again. I did not anticipate a reply, because the impact of those 5 words did not depend on response. It depended on recognition, and recognition would come in its own time. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to settle fully into what I had just done, because there was no need to revisit it, no need to question it. The message had been clear, complete, and final in the way it needed to be. I opened my eyes again and looked ahead, the road stretching forward, clean, uninterrupted, the snow pushed aside just enough to reveal the path beneath, and in that simple image, I saw something that felt familiar, not from memory, but from understanding, because for the first time in a long time, the direction ahead did not feel uncertain, it felt open. I shifted the car into drive and pulled back onto the road, leaving the quiet street behind me, not as someone who had been pushed out, but as someone who had stepped forward, and as the distance grew, I knew that whatever happened next would no longer be defined by what they had decided for me, but by what I had chosen for myself, and that difference, quiet as it was enough to change everything. I had driven for nearly 20 minutes before I finally glanced at my phone again, not out of impatience, not out of expectation, but because I understood that enough time had passed for the message to reach him, to settle, to begin doing what it was meant to do. The screen lit up quietly when I tapped it, and there it was, a single notification, his name, nothing more. I opened it without hesitation, my expression unchanged, my breathing steady, and I read his reply once slowly, not because it was long, but because of what it carried. What do you mean by that? The words were simple, almost restrained, but they told me everything I needed to know. There was no anger, no dismissal, no attempt to assert control, just confusion, and beneath that confusion, something else beginning to take shape. I set the phone back down without responding, because I did not need to clarify anything further. The 5 words I had sent were not meant to open a conversation. They were meant to end an illusion, and that had already begun. I turned onto a quieter road, lined with bare trees dusted lightly with snow, their branches still, unmoving, like witnesses to something that had already passed. I slowed the car slightly, not because I needed to, but because there was no urgency anymore. Everything that needed to happen had already been set in motion. I thought about the way Daniel had looked at me that morning, the shift in his posture, the moment his certainty had faltered, and I realized that what had changed was not just his understanding of the documents but his understanding of me. For years I had been predictable to him, steady, accommodating, someone who would adjust without question, someone who would step aside when asked, and that version of me had made it easy for him to believe that last night's decision would hold, that it would go unchallenged. But now that version no longer fit, and the space it had occupied was being replaced with something else, something quieter, but far more defined. I drove a little further before pulling into a small parking lot near a park, the kind of place families visited in warmer months, now nearly empty, the benches dusted with snow, the paths faintly visible beneath it. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, the silence settling around me again. But it felt different now, not reflective, not transitional but complete. I picked up my phone once more, not to check for another message, but simply to hold it, to feel the weight of what had just taken place, because it was not the message itself that mattered, it was what it represented. A line that had been drawn clearly, without force, without anger, but with finality. I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me, the cold air meeting me again, but it no longer felt sharp, it felt clean. I walked slowly toward one of the benches, my steps steady, leaving faint impressions in the snow, and I sat down, placing my purse beside me, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I looked out across the park, the open space stretching ahead, untouched, quiet, and for a moment, I allowed myself to simply sit there, not thinking, not analyzing, just being present in a way I had not allowed myself to be for a long time. my phone vibrated softly beside me. I glanced down, another message. I opened it without hesitation. His words appearing on the screen. I did not realize. And then nothing more, no explanation, no defense, just that simple acknowledgement, and I understood it immediately, not as an apology, not yet, but as the beginning of something he had not been prepared to face. I did not respond. I did not need to, because the conversation had already shifted beyond words. I leaned back slightly against the bench, my gaze returning to the open space ahead. And I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the small silences, the overlooked conversations, the assumptions that had been allowed to grow without question. And I realized that none of it had been sudden, none of it had happened overnight. It had been building slowly, quietly, until it reached a point where it could no longer remain unseen. And now that it had been seen, it could not return to what it had been before. I picked up the envelope once more, holding it in my hands, feeling its edges, its weight, not as something I needed to protect, but as something that had already done its work. I placed it back in my purse and closed it, my movements calm, deliberate, final in their own quiet way. I stood up slowly, brushing a light layer of snow from the edge of the bench, and looked around once more, the park still empty, the air still, the world continuing forward without interruption. And in that simplicity, I found something that felt unexpectedly steady, not relief, not triumph, but clarity, the kind that does not fade, the kind that does not depend on anyone else's response. I walked back to my car, my steps firm, unhurried, and as I opened the door and slid into the seat, I understood something with complete certainty. I had not lost my place, I had only stopped allowing others to define it. I started the engine again, the sound steady and familiar, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, I did not look back, not at the park, not at the road I had taken to get here, because forward was no longer uncertain. It was simply the direction I had chosen, and whatever came next would not be decided in a moment of silence at a dinner table. It would be shaped with clarity, with presence, and with a voice that no longer needed to be raised to be heard.